Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kieran, and today I'm going to share with you something that happened to me 3 summers ago. Something that still keeps me awake at night. Something that changed my entire perspective on what lurks in the darkness of our world. I worked at a summer camp called Camp Oakwood, and what I discovered there, what I witnessed, what hunted us in those woods, it's something I was never supposed to tell you, but I can't keep it inside anymore. The screams, they still echo in my head, and the children, oh God, the children. Before I begin, I can see that 80% of my viewers haven't subscribed while watching my videos, so please, hit that subscribe button, give the video a thumbs up, and ring that notification bell. From wherever you're watching this video, please comment below. I love to hear from you. Tell me what time you're watching this, and if you have your own supernatural story, email us or comment below. We read every single message. Now, let me take you back to that summer, to Camp Oakwood, nestled deep in the forests of British Columbia, where the trees are so thick that sunlight barely touches the ground, and where something ancient, something hungry, was waiting for us. It was June 2021. I had just finished my second year of college and needed money for the fall semester. The job posting for Camp Oakwood seemed perfect. Decent pay, beautiful location. Working with kids, what could go wrong? Right. I remember driving up that winding mountain road, my old Honda struggling with the steep incline. The GPS signal had died about 20 miles back, and all I had were the handwritten directions they'd mailed me. Turn left at the lightning-struck oak. Continue past the abandoned gas station. When you see the stone markers, you're almost there. The camp itself was picturesque, in a way that felt almost too perfect, like something out of a postcard. Rustic cabins scattered around a pristine lake. A dining hall that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. And everywhere, these strange stone markers. Ancient-looking things carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The camp director, Aurora Blackthorn, she was intense, mid-40s, with these piercing green eyes that seemed to see right through you. She had this habit of appearing, wherever you were working, silently, like she materialized out of thin air. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, and when she spoke, it was always in this measured, careful tone, like every word was chosen for maximum impact. During orientation, she gathered all 15 staff members in the main lodge. The building creaked constantly, even when there was no wind. She stood before this massive stone fireplace, carved with the same strange symbols as the markers, and began telling us about the camp's history. Camp Oakwood had been operating for over 80 years, she said, founded by her grandfather, Dorian Blackthorn, after he'd purchased the land from the local indigenous tribe. She paused here, her eyes scanning our faces. The tribe had been reluctant to sell, she continued. They'd warned her grandfather about the land, told him stories about something that lived deep in the woods, something that fed on innocence. She laughed then, a sound like breaking glass. Of course, those were just old superstitions, she said. The important thing was that we maintained the camp's reputation for excellence and safety. Always safety. She emphasized that word in a way that made my skin crawl. The other counselors seemed normal enough. There was Tobias, a tall guy from Melbourne who taught archery. He had these nervous habits, constantly checking over his shoulder, jumping at unexpected sounds. He'd been working at the camp for 3 summers, and there was something haunted about him, like he'd seen things he wished he could forget. Juniper was the arts and crafts coordinator, a bubbly redhead from Wellington who seemed to radiate positivity, at least during the day. I noticed she never smiled after sunset, and she had this ritual of checking and rechecking all the locks before bed. When I asked her about it, she just said that old buildings make her nervous. Then there was Celeste, the head lifeguard. She was from Edinburgh, with a thick Scottish accent and arms covered in intricate tattoos. She was the only one who seemed completely unafraid, but I later learned that was because she knew the truth. She'd been preparing for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to act. The first week passed without incident. The kids arrived, about 60 of them, ages 7 to 15. They were typical summer campers, excited to be away from home, eager to make new friends, completely unaware of the darkness that surrounded them. I was assigned to cabin 7, 8 boys between the ages of 9 and 11. They were good kids. Jamie from Vancouver, who was obsessed with ghost stories. Marcus from London, who collected insects. Aiden from Sydney, who could play guitar like someone twice his age. And 5 others who looked up to me like I had all the answers. If only they knew how wrong they were. The first strange thing happened on day 3. I was leading my cabin on a nature hike, following one of the marked trails that wound deep into the forest. The kids were laughing and exploring, collecting interesting rocks and leaves, when suddenly they all went quiet. Not the normal quiet of children who'd found something fascinating, but the unnatural silence of prey animals sensing a predator. They'd stopped moving, stopped breathing almost, just standing there, staring deeper into the woods. I followed their gaze and saw nothing. Just trees and shadows, but the shadows seemed wrong somehow. Too dark, too deep, moving independently of the wind. And there was this smell, like copper in decay, growing stronger with each passing second. Jamie was the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Kieran, do you see it?" I looked where he was pointing, deeper into the forest where the shadows were thickest, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something. A shape that was almost human, but wrong in every conceivable way. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Before I could get a better look, it was gone. But the smell lingered, and the children remained frozen until I physically turned them around and marched them back to camp. None of them spoke about what they'd seen, but I noticed they all slept with their flashlights that night. That evening, I approached Tobias during dinner. The dining hall was full of laughter and conversation, but he was sitting alone, picking at his food, his eyes constantly darting to the windows. I asked him about the hiking trails, whether there was anything I should know about the deeper parts of the forest. His face went pale, and he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "You didn't go past the second marker, did you?" When I nodded, his grip tightened. "Christ, Kieran, you can't take the kids that far. Not after sunset. Not ever after sunset." He looked around nervously, then leaned closer. "There are things in these woods, things that have been here longer than the camp, longer than any of us can imagine. Aurora knows, she's always known, but the camp, it feeds them, keeps them satisfied most of the time." I thought he was just trying to scare the new guy, until he rolled up his sleeves. His forearms were covered in scars long, parallel gouges that looked like claw marks. "Second summer," he whispered. "I was leading a night hike, thought I was being responsible, staying on the trails, following all the rules, but it found us anyway." He described waking up 3 days later in the camp infirmary, with no memory of what had happened. The official story was that he'd fallen down a ravine, but the wounds told a different story. And one of his campers, little Sarah from Toronto, she'd never come back. They found her backpack 2 weeks later, shredded and covered in something that wasn't quite blood. But Sarah herself, she was never found. The search and rescue teams combed every inch of those woods, brought in dogs, helicopters, volunteers from 3 provinces, but it was like she'd simply vanished from existence. The police questioned everyone, investigated every possibility, but eventually, they had to accept that sometimes children just disappear. Aurora had handled everything. Tobias continued. She dealt with the police, the media, parents, with an efficiency that was almost inhuman. She'd known exactly what to say, what forms to file, what stories to tell, like she'd done it before, many times before. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified. Every shadow looked like it was moving. I kept thinking about what Tobias had said, about things that fed, about children who disappeared. I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on our cabin door, just like Juniper did. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it, a sound that made my blood freeze. It started as a low whistle, almost like wind through the trees, but gradually morphed into something else, something that sounded almost like singing, but wrong, discordant, like a lullaby played backwards. I crept to the window, careful not to wake the boys, and peered out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just the normal camp landscape bathed in pale moonlight. But then movement near the tree line. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend like liquid shadow. It was moving between the trees, not walking exactly, more like flowing, like it was made of the darkness itself, and it was heading toward the younger children's cabins. I should have called for help, should have woken Aurora or the other counselors, but something stopped me. Some primal instinct told me that making noise, drawing attention, would be the worst possible thing I could do. So I watched, frozen with terror, as this thing stalked through our camp. It stopped outside cabin 3, where the youngest girls were sleeping. It stood there for what felt like hours, swaying slightly, like it was listening, or maybe tasting the air. Then it began to change. Its form shifted, compressed, until it looked almost human, almost normal. It reached for the cabin door, and to my horror, the door opened. It shouldn't have. The doors were all locked. I checked them myself, but it opened anyway, like the locks meant nothing to this creature. I waited for screams, for some sign that the children had woken up, but there was only silence. That terrible, unnatural silence that I was beginning to associate with this thing. It was inside the cabin for maybe 10 minutes, though it felt like a lifetime. When it finally emerged, it had returned to its original form, tall and shadow-like and wrong. But now, it was carrying something, a small bundle wrapped in what looked like a blanket. It moved quickly back into the forest, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. And I knew, with horrible certainty, that one of those little girls was gone. The next morning, cabin 3 was in chaos. 6-year-old Emily from Ottawa was missing. Her bed was empty. Her belongings were gone. But there was no sign of a struggle, no broken windows, no forced entry. She had simply vanished. Aurora handled the situation with that same unnerving efficiency Tobias had described. She called the police, contacted the parents, organized search parties, all while maintaining this calm, collected demeanor that felt completely inappropriate for the situation. When I tried to tell her what I'd seen, she looked at me with those piercing green eyes and said, "Night terrors are common in stressful situations. Kieran, the isolation, the responsibility, it can play tricks on your mind." But I knew what I'd seen, and I wasn't the only one. Celeste approached me during the search, while we were pretending to look for clues in the forest. She grabbed my arm and pulled me aside. "You saw it too, didn't you?" When I nodded, she looked relieved. Thank God. I was beginning to think I was losing my mind. She told me she'd been researching the camp's history, digging into old newspaper archives, police reports, missing person cases. What she'd found was horrifying. Children had been disappearing from Camp Oakwood for decades, always during the summer, always without a trace. The pattern went back to the very first year the camp opened. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Aurora's family had been covering it up for generations, bribing officials, intimidating witnesses, using their wealth and connections to make problems disappear, just like the children. The local indigenous tribe had been right. There was something in these woods, something ancient and hungry, and the Blackthorn family had been feeding it for 80 years. Celeste had been working with a small group of investigators, people who'd lost children to the camp, who'd been searching for answers for years. They called themselves the Lost Parents, and they'd been planning to expose the truth, but they needed proof, evidence that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. That's when she told me about the basement. There was a room beneath the main lodge, behind a hidden door that only the Blackthorn family was supposed to know about. That's where they kept the records, the real records, documentation of every child who'd ever disappeared, every sacrifice they'd made to keep their family's dark bargain intact. The creature in the woods, she explained, was something called a shadow feeder, a primordial entity that sustained itself on innocence and terror. It had been bound to this land for thousands of years, sleeping, waiting, until Dorian Blackthorn had awakened it with his greed and ambition. Now it was awake, and it was hungry, and the camp provided a steady supply of victims. But there were rules, ancient laws that even this creature had to follow. It could only take one child per summer, and only if certain conditions were met. The child had to be isolated, afraid, calling out for help that would never come. That's why the disappearances always happened during night activities, camping trips, late-night swims, situations where a child might find themselves alone and vulnerable. We had to stop it, she said, not just for Emily, who was already lost, but for all the other children who would come after her. The creature was growing stronger, more bold, Soon it would stop following the old rules, and the disappearances would accelerate, until every child who entered these woods was at risk. The plan was simple, but terrifying. We would break into the basement, gather the evidence we needed, and then, when the creature came hunting again, we would be ready. Celeste had been preparing for 3 years, studying the old texts, learning the rituals, gathering the tools. We would need to send this thing back to whatever hell it had crawled out of. But first, we needed to get the children to safety. All of them, without alerting Aurora to what we knew. That meant maintaining the normal camp schedule, keeping up appearances, while secretly preparing for war. The next few days were a nightmare of forced normalcy. We led activities, supervised meals, tucked the children into their beds, all while knowing that something was stalking them, hunting them, choosing its next victim. The other counselors seemed oblivious, or maybe they were just better at pretending. But I could see the strain on Tobias's face, the way Juniper jumped at every shadow, the careful way everyone avoided looking directly at the forest after dark. Emily's disappearance had been reported as a tragic accident, a drowning in the lake during an unauthorized midnight swim. Her body was never found, of course, but that wasn't unusual for these deep mountain lakes. The official investigation was wrapped up in record time. Another example of the BLSAVRNE family's influence, their ability to make inconvenient truths disappear. But the children knew something was wrong. They gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves, creating elaborate theories about what had really happened to Emily. Some of them were getting closer to the truth than anyone realized. Jamie from my cabin had started having nightmares, waking up screaming about shadows with too many arms, about something singing in a language that hurt to hear. On the 5th night after Emily's disappearance, Celeste and I made our move. We waited until the camp was asleep, until even the night sounds of the forest had faded to nothing. Then we crept out of our cabins and made our way to the main lodge. The building looked different in the darkness, older, more sinister, like the civilized facade had been stripped away to reveal something primitive and hungry underneath. The front door was locked, but Celeste had a key, stolen from Aurora's office during one of her previous reconnaissance missions. Inside, the lodge felt like a tomb. Our flashlights cut weak paths through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. The floorboards creaked ominously under our feet, and every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. The hidden door was behind a massive fireplace, concealed by a stone panel that looked identical to all the others. Celeste showed me the sequence of symbols to press, carved runes that hurt to look at directly. As the panel slid aside, a wave of cold air rushed out, carrying with it the smell of decay and old terror. The basement was worse than I'd imagined. The walls were covered in symbols, painted in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. In the center of the room sat an ancient stone altar, stained dark with decades of use. And everywhere, scattered across tables and shelves, were the records. Journals dating back to 1941, meticulously documenting every child who had disappeared, their names, ages, the circumstances of their disappearance. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part were the photographs. Polaroids and old black and white pictures showing children's faces, frozen in expressions of pure terror, their eyes wide with the knowledge of what was about to happen to them. Celeste was photographing everything with her phone, building the evidence we would need to expose the truth. But I was drawn to one particular journal, bound in leather that felt wrong to touch. The pages were filled with Dorian Blackthorn's handwriting, describing his first encounter with the Shadow Feeder. He found it while exploring the deeper caves, drawn by stories the local tribe had told about a place where the dead walked among the living. What he discovered was something far worse. A creature of pure hunger, ancient beyond human comprehension, that had been waiting in the darkness for someone foolish enough to wake it. But Dorian had seen opportunity where others saw danger. The creature offered him a bargain, prosperity, wealth, success beyond his wildest dreams. All he had to do was feed it. 1 child per year, delivered at the height of summer, when the barriers between worlds were thinnest. A small price to pay for everything he'd ever wanted. The first sacrifice had been his own daughter, Miranda Blackthorn, 8 years old. She'd been playing by the lake when her father led her into the woods, told her they were going on a special adventure. Just the two of them. By the time she realized what was happening, it was too late. The creature had tasted innocence, and it was hungry for more. That's when I heard it. Footsteps on the stairs above us, slow, deliberate, getting closer. Celeste grabbed my arm, her face pale in the flashlight beam. We have to go now. But it was too late. The footsteps had stopped, and standing in the doorway was Aurora. But not the Aurora we knew. This version was wrong, twisted. Her eyes had turned completely black, and her smile revealed teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. She'd been transformed, possessed, by the same entity that had been feeding on children for decades. I wondered when someone would finally find their way down here. She said, her voice layered with harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The curious ones always do eventually. It's what makes them such perfect bait. She began to descend the stairs, her movements too fluid, too graceful, like she was floating rather than walking. Did you really think I didn't know what you were planning? Celeste, I've been watching you for 3 years, waiting, letting you gather your little group of investigators, your lost parents. They make such devoted followers, when properly motivated. That's when I realized the horrible truth. The lost parents weren't investigating the disappearances. They were part of them. They were the ones who delivered the children, their own children, to the creature, transformed by grief and despair into willing servants of the thing that had destroyed their lives. Celeste laughed, but it wasn't her laugh. It was something else, something that wore her voice like an ill-fitting mask. Oh, Kieran, sweet, naive Kieran, did you really think this was about saving the children? This is about feeding them to something so much hungrier than you can possibly imagine. The walls began to shift, breathing like living tissue. The symbols carved into the stone started to glow with the sickly green light, and from somewhere deep in the darkness, I could hear singing, that same backwards lullaby I'd heard the night Emily disappeared. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was dozens, maybe hundreds, all the children who had disappeared over the years, all of them calling out from whatever dimension the creature had dragged them to, all of them begging for release that would never come. I ran. There was nothing else I could do. I abandoned Celeste to whatever fate awaited her in that basement, and I ran, up the stairs, through the lodge, out into the night, where at least I could see the stars, where the darkness wasn't quite so complete. But I wasn't alone. The forest was full of movement, shapes that slipped between the trees, like liquid shadow. And from every direction, I could hear children's voices calling my name, begging me to help them, to save them, to join them in their eternal suffering. I made it back to my cabin somehow and barricaded the door with everything I could move. The boys were still sleeping, innocent and unaware of the horror surrounding them. I should have woken them, should have gotten them to safety. But where was safe when the entire camp was a trap, when every adult was either complicit or possessed? The singing grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from inside the cabin itself, from under the beds, from inside the closets, from the very walls that were supposed to protect us. One by one, the boys began to stir, to wake, their eyes reflecting that same unnatural light I'd seen in Aurora's gaze. Jamie was the first to speak, but it wasn't Jamie anymore. Come play with us, Mr. Kieran. Come play with us forever and ever and ever. His voice was layered with others, dozens of other children, all speaking in unison, all wearing his face like a mask. That's when I understood. The creature didn't just feed on the children. It collected them, absorbed them, made them part of its eternal chorus of the damned. Every child who had ever disappeared was still here, still trapped, still suffering. And now they wanted me to join them. The walls began to dissolve, melting away like ice in the sun, revealing the true nature of the place I'd been trapped in. It wasn't a camp at all. It was something else, something that existed in the spaces between reality, a hunting ground that wore the disguise of summer fun and childhood innocence. I found myself standing in a vast cavern, lit by the same sickly green light that had filled the basement. The ceiling stretched up into infinity, and the walls were covered in alcoves, thousands of them, each one containing the remains of a child, their bones arranged in ritualistic patterns, their skulls facing inward toward the center of the chamber. And there, at the heart of it all, was the shadow feeder itself, fully manifested, no longer hiding behind shadows and suggestion. It was massive, ancient, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Its form shifted constantly, sometimes appearing almost human, sometimes revealing itself as something so alien that looking at it directly caused physical pain. It spoke to me, not with words, but with images, emotions, memories that weren't my own. It showed me the history of the world, the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of species. All of it meaningless, temporary, compared to its eternal hunger, its endless need for sustenance. It offered me the same bargain it had offered Dorian Blackthorne all those years ago. Power, wealth, success. All I had to do was help it feed, help it collect the innocent souls it needed to maintain its existence. One small compromise, one tiny moral sacrifice, and I could have everything I'd ever dreamed of. But I'd seen what that bargain had cost the Blackthorne family. I'd seen how it had twisted them, corrupted them, turned them into something barely human. And I knew that whatever it was offering, the price was too high, would always be too high. So I did the only thing I could do. I ran again, through the cavern, past the alcoves full of children's bones, past the chorus of the damned who called out for me to stay, to join them, to become part of their eternal suffering. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, and I collapsed in the darkness. When I woke up, I was lying in a hospital bed in Vancouver, machines beeping around me, for tubes in my arms, and a police officer sitting in the corner, waiting for me to regain consciousness. The camp, he told me, had been destroyed in a fire, a tragic accident, gas leak in the main lodge. No survivors among the staff or campers. But that wasn't true, and I knew it. The fire had been started deliberately, probably by Aurora or one of her family members, to cover up what had really happened, to destroy the evidence, to silence the witnesses. They'd done it before, many times, and they'd do it again. The official story was that I'd suffered a complete mental breakdown, that I'd been found 3 days later, wandering through the forest in a state of complete dissociation, talking about shadows and monsters and children who sang backwards lullabies. The doctors diagnosed me with severe PTSD, stress-induced psychosis, and recommended immediate psychiatric treatment. I spent 6 months in a mental health facility, learning to tell the doctors what they wanted to hear, learning to pretend that I believed their version of events, learning to hide the truth behind a mask of recovered sanity. But I never forgot. I never stopped believing, and I never stopped planning, because I knew the truth. The shadow feeder was still out there, still hungry, still feeding. The BLACHRNE family would find another location, another camp, another supply of innocent victims to offer their ancient patron. And eventually, they would make a mistake, leave a trail, create evidence that couldn't be covered up or explained away. That's why I'm telling you this story. Because somewhere out there, in the forests of British Columbia or Alberta, or maybe even further afield, there's another Camp Oakwood, another group of children arriving for what they think will be the best summer of their lives. Another group of counselors who have no idea what they're walking into. If you see job postings for remote summer camps, especially ones run by the Blackthorne family or their associates, stay away. If you hear stories about children disappearing during outdoor activities, investigate, ask questions. Don't let them be dismissed as accidents or drownings or getting lost in the woods. And if you're ever camping or hiking in remote areas, especially at night, and you hear singing, that backwards lullaby that sounds almost beautiful until you realize what it really is, don't look back. Don't try to investigate. Don't let curiosity override your survival instincts. Because some things in this world are better left undisturbed. Some hungers are better left unfed. The creature I encountered at Camp Oakwood, the shadow feeder, it's still out there, still waiting, still collecting innocence to sustain its ancient existence. And until someone finds a way to stop it permanently, to break the bargain that Dorian Blackthorne made all those decades ago, children will continue to disappear, families will continue to grieve, and the chorus of the damned will continue to grow. I've dedicated my life to hunting this thing, to gathering evidence, to finding others who have encountered it and survived. There aren't many of us, but we're out there, and we're watching. We call ourselves the survivors, and we've made it our mission to expose the truth, to save the children who haven't been taken yet, to honor the memory of those who have. If you have information about unusual disappearances at summer camps, if you've encountered something similar, to what I've described. If you've seen the shadows move independently of their sources, or heard children singing songs that don't exist, contact us. You can find us if you know where to look. If you're brave enough to seek the truth behind the comfortable lies society tells itself. But be careful, because the Blackthorn family and their allies have resources, connections, ways of making inconvenient people disappear just as thoroughly as they make inconvenient children vanish. They've been perfecting their methods for 80 years, and they don't leave loose ends. I've moved 7 times in the past 3 years, changed my name twice, learned to live off the grid, to avoid cameras and social media and anything that might leave a trail, because I know they're looking for me. I know they want to silence me before I can expose their secret, before I can save the next group of children. But I'm not the only one they're hunting. Tobias survived the fire at Camp Oakwood, though he was badly burned, scarred physically and mentally by what he experienced. He reached out to me 6 months ago, told me he'd been having visions of a new camp, a new location where the shadow feeder was preparing to hunt again. This time, it was in the mountains of Alberta, a place called Camp Silverpine, run by Marlo Blackthorn, Aurora's younger sister, who had learned from the mistakes made at Oakwood. This new operation was smaller, more selective, targeting children from wealthy families who could afford the premium fees for an exclusive wilderness experience. But wealth couldn't protect them from what was waiting in those woods. Money meant nothing to a creature that fed on innocence and terror. In fact, the isolation that came with exclusive camps, the distance from civilization, the reduced likelihood of immediate investigation when children disappeared, all of that made Silverpine an even better hunting ground than Oakwood had ever been. Tobias and I spent months planning, researching, gathering the tools and knowledge we would need to face the shadow feeder on its own territory. We studied the old texts, learned the rituals, prepared ourselves for a battle that would probably cost us our lives. But we couldn't let another group of children suffer. Couldn't let the cycle continue. We arrived at Camp Silverpine in early July, posing as maintenance workers hired to repair some of the older buildings. It was smaller than Oakwood had been, maybe 30 children, but the same familiar signs were all there. The stone markers carved with ancient symbols, the dining hall built over what was clearly a much older foundation, the forest that seemed to watch everything that happened in the camp. And Marlo Blackthorn was there, younger than Aurora had been, but with the same piercing green eyes, the same unnatural grace, the same ability to appear wherever you were without making a sound. She welcomed us to the camp with enthusiasm, but there was something predatory about her smile, like she was already imagining how we would taste. The first disappearance happened on our 3rd day there. A 12-year-old girl from Calgary named Winter. She'd been participating in a nighttime astronomy activity, learning about constellations, when she'd simply vanished. One moment she was there, pointing up at the Big Dipper. The next moment her counselor was calling her name into empty darkness. But this time, we were ready. Tobias and I had been monitoring the forest, watching for the signs we'd learned to recognize, the unnatural silence, the shadows that moved wrong, the smell of copper and decay that preceded the creature's arrival. We saw it emerge from the deeper woods, saw it stalk toward the group of children, and we acted. The ritual Celeste had been preparing for 3 years, the one she died trying to complete, required specific components. Silver blessed by 7 different priests, salt from the oldest ocean, fire kindled from wood that had never seen sunlight, and most importantly, the willing sacrifice of someone who had looked into the creature's true face and chosen to defy it. Tobias went first. He walked out into the clearing where Winter's astronomy class had been held, where the shadow feeder was already beginning to manifest, and he began the incantation. Words in a language that hurt to speak, syllables that felt like broken glass scraping against your throat. The creature turned its attention to him, recognizing him from their previous encounter. Remembering the taste of his fear, his blood, it began to change, to take on the form it had worn in his nightmares for 3 years, tall and terrible and beautiful in its alien perfection. But Tobias didn't run. He stood his ground, continued the ritual, even as the creature reached for him with claws that could slice through reality itself. He held the blessed silver, the ancient salt, the impossible fire, and he spoke words of binding, of banishment, of eternal imprisonment. The shadow feeder screamed, a sound that shattered windows 3 kilometers away, that caused every electronic device in the camp to malfunction, that sent every animal within 50 kilometers fleeing in terror. It lashed out at Tobias, tore through his chest with claws that left wounds no earthly medicine could heal. But the ritual held. The binding took effect. The creature found itself trapped, caught between dimensions, unable to feed, unable to escape, unable to maintain its hold on our reality. For the first time in thousands of years, it was vulnerable. That's when I acted, using the blessed dagger Celeste had prepared. I struck at the creature's heart, if it could be called a heart. The blade passed through its shifting form, found something solid, something vital, and the shadow feeder began to dissolve, to fade, to be pulled back into whatever dark dimension it had originally crawled out of. But its death throes were devastating. The ground shook, the trees burst into flame, the lake boiled, and from somewhere deep in the earth, I could hear the voices of all the children it had taken over the years, finally finding peace, finally allowed to move on to whatever comes after this world. Tobias died in my arms, his sacrifice successful but costly. With his final breath, he whispered that it was worth it, that the children were free, that the cycle was finally broken. But even as he spoke, I could see Marlo Blackthorn in the distance, watching, waiting, already planning her next move. Because while we destroyed the shadow feeder, we hadn't destroyed the family that had served it for generations. They had other contacts, other patrons, other ancient entities that hungered for what only innocence could provide. Marlo disappeared that night, along with most of the camp staff, but not before I heard her making phone calls, urgent whispered conversations in languages I didn't recognize. She was calling in favors, activating networks that had been dormant for decades, preparing to rebuild what we had torn down. The surviving children were evacuated, their memories carefully altered by specialists the Blackthorn family kept on retainer. Psychiatrists who specialized in implanting false memories, making traumatic experiences seem like nothing more than bad dreams or stress-induced hallucinations. By the time they returned to their families, they remembered nothing more than a fun summer camp that had ended early due to a forest fire. I spent the next 6 months in hiding, moving from safe house to safe house, trying to process what we had accomplished, what we had lost. Tobias had given everything to stop the shadow feeder, but I knew his sacrifice would be meaningless if we didn't expose the entire network, the whole conspiracy that had enabled these horrors for generations. That's when I discovered the truth about the survivors, the group I thought I had been part of. Turns out we were just the tip of the iceberg. There were others, dozens of others, people who had encountered the BLFRNE family's various operations over the years, people who had lost children, friends, loved ones to creatures that should never have existed in our world. Dr. Evelyn Cross from Winnipeg had been tracking unusual disappearances for 20 years. Her own son David had vanished during a school camping trip in Saskatchewan in 2003. The official investigation had concluded he'd fallen into a river and drowned, but Evelyn knew better. She'd seen the photographs from the crime scene, noticed the symbols carved into nearby trees, recognized the same patterns that appeared wherever the Blackthorn family operated. Father Martinez from Mexico City had lost his entire congregation to something calling itself Camp Esperanza, a religious retreat center that promised spiritual enlightenment for troubled youth. 63 children had entered those mountains in the summer of 2018. None had ever come back. The Mexican authorities had blamed cartels, gang violence, but Father Martinez had found evidence of something far more sinister. Professor Helena Voss from Oxford had been researching historical disappearances, ancient texts that spoke of entities that fed on human innocence. She traced the BLSRNE family's activities back over 2 centuries, discovered that they weren't just running summer camps. They operated boarding schools, youth rehabilitation centers, religious compounds, anywhere they could access vulnerable children without interference. Together, we began to understand the true scope of what we were fighting. The shadow feeder had been just one entity among many. The BLSRNE family served as intermediaries, brokers who connected ancient hungers with modern prey. They had been building a network of feeding grounds across North America for generations, each one designed to provide steady sustenance for creatures that existed in the spaces between our world and others. But we also learned about their weaknesses, their limitations. The entities they serve were bound by ancient laws, cosmic rules, that even their alien hunger could not violate. They could only manifest in places of power, locations where the barriers between dimensions were naturally thin. They needed human agents to lure victims into their domains. And most importantly, they could be destroyed if confronted with sufficient knowledge, preparation, and sacrifice. The BLHRNE family knew we were hunting them. They'd begun consolidating their operations, moving their most valuable assets to secure locations. But they'd also made a crucial mistake. In their haste to rebuild after the loss of Camp Silverpine, they'd reached out to new partners, criminals and cultists who lacked their family's centuries of experience and discretion. That's how we learned about Midnight Meadows, a new operation being established in the forests of northern Ontario. This wasn't a summer camp. It was something far more ambitious. A year-round facility disguised as a treatment center for troubled youth, where parents could send their difficult children and trust that they would receive the help they needed. The facility was being run by Dr. Nathaniel Thorne, Marlowe's cousin, a man who had spent 20 years perfecting techniques for psychological manipulation, for breaking down a child's natural defenses, for preparing them to serve purposes that would have horrified their families. He advertised his methods as breakthrough treatments for behavioral disorders, revolutionary approaches to juvenile rehabilitation. But we knew the truth. Midnight Meadows wasn't designed to help children. It was designed to process them, to transform them into perfect vessels for entities that required very specific forms of sustenance. The facility would operate for years, decades, providing a steady supply of victims while maintaining a facade of legitimate medical practice. We couldn't let that happen, couldn't allow another generation of children to suffer the fate that had befallen those at Camp Oakwood and Camp Silverpine. But this time, our enemy was prepared for us. Dr. Thorne knew we were coming, had been studying our methods, learning from the mistakes that had led to the destruction of the Shadow Feeder. The facility itself was a fortress, built on land that had been sacred to indigenous peoples for thousands of years, a place where the barriers between worlds had always been thin. Dr. Thorne had corrupted that sacred space, twisted it into something that would attract the kind of entities his family served. The buildings were constructed according to specific geometric patterns, designed to channel and amplify supernatural energies. Security was provided by former military contractors, people who asked no questions as long as the money was good. They were armed with more than conventional weapons. Dr. Thorne had given them tools that could harm things that bullets couldn't touch, amulets that provided protection against supernatural influence, communication devices that worked even when reality itself was being distorted. But we had advantages too. Our network of survivors had been growing, recruiting new members who brought unique skills and knowledge to our cause. Jackson Wolfe, a former RCMP officer whose partner had disappeared while investigating unusual activities in British Columbia. He brought tactical expertise and law enforcement connections that proved invaluable in planning our assault. Marina Santos from Brazil had survived her own encounter with entities similar to the Shadow Feeder. Her village had been consumed by something calling itself the hunger of the deep. She was the only survivor, and she'd spent 15 years learning how to fight things that existed outside normal reality. Her knowledge of protective rituals and banishment techniques was crucial to our preparation. Dr. Erik Larsen from Norway had been studying the historical records of similar phenomena across Scandinavia, ancient texts that described beings of shadow and hunger that had plagued humanity for millennia. He discovered that these entities followed predictable patterns, seasonal cycles that determined when they were strongest, when they were most vulnerable. According to his research, we had a window of opportunity, a brief period during the autumn equinox when the barriers between dimensions would be in flux, when the entities would be distracted by cosmic forces beyond their control. It would be our only chance to infiltrate Midnight Meadows and destroy whatever was being prepared there before it could fully manifest. The facility had been operating for 8 months when we finally made our move. 47 children had been admitted during that time, Their parents told they were receiving cutting-edge treatment for everything from ADHD to oppositional defiant disorder. In reality, they were being systematically broken down, the natural psychological defenses stripped away, their innate innocence concentrated and refined for purposes too horrible to imagine. Our assault began at midnight on September 21st, the exact moment when day and night stood in perfect balance, when the cosmic forces Dr. Larson had studied would be at their most chaotic. Jackson led a team of former military personnel through the perimeter defenses, while Marina and I approached the main building using routes she'd identified during her scouting missions. The facility was unlike anything I had encountered before. The corridors seemed to shift and change as we moved through them. Doors appeared where there had been walls moments before. Stairways led to floors that shouldn't have existed. Dr. Thorne had transformed the entire building into a kind of supernatural maze, designed to disorient intruders and channel them toward traps he'd prepared. But Marina had experience with this kind of spatial distortion. Her village had been consumed by something that warped reality in similar ways. She led me through the maze using techniques her grandfather had taught her, methods for navigating spaces that existed partially outside normal geometry, following shadows that fell in impossible directions, listening for sounds that came from directions that didn't exist. We found the children in the basement levels, dozens of them locked in cells that had been carved from living rock. Their eyes were vacant, empty, like windows into rooms where nobody lived anymore. Whatever Dr. Thorne had been doing to them had stripped away everything that made them human, leaving only hollow vessels waiting to be filled with something else. But some of them could still be saved, the newer arrivals who hadn't been completely processed yet. Marina began the liberation ritual while I stood guard, using techniques she'd learned from her grandfather to restore the spiritual connections that Dr. Thorne had severed. It was dangerous work. Each child we freed sent shockwaves through the facility's supernatural infrastructure. That's when Dr. Thorne finally revealed himself, emerging from shadows that shouldn't have been deep enough to hide a human figure. But he wasn't entirely human anymore. Years of exposure to the entities his family served had changed him, transformed him into something that could exist comfortably in the spaces between worlds. He spoke in voices that came from multiple directions simultaneously, told us we were too late, that the great work was already complete, that the entities his family had been serving for generations were ready to emerge fully into our reality. The children we'd found were just the beginning, practice subjects used to perfect techniques that would soon be applied on a much larger scale. Midnight Meadows was never meant to be a permanent installation. It was a testing ground, a place to refine methods that would soon be deployed at facilities around the world. The BLA Skitchwarani family had been building a network of processing centers for decades, disguising them as schools, hospitals, rehabilitation centers, residential facilities for at-risk youth. But the entities they served required more than just individual victims. They needed mass sacrifice, coordinated feeding events that would provide enough spiritual energy to tear permanent holes in reality, to create stable passages between dimensions, to allow their ancient patrons to walk freely in our world without the need for human intermediaries. Dr. Thorne laughed as he revealed this plan, a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. He told us that stopping Midnight Meadows would accomplish nothing, that there were dozens of other facilities already operational, that the process of dimensional breach was already underway in locations we'd never discovered. That's when the building began to shake, the walls started bleeding, and from somewhere deep beneath the foundation, we could hear something vast and hungry beginning to wake up. Dr. Thorne had been using the children as bait, their concentrated innocence as a lure to attract something that had been sleeping in the deep places of the earth for thousands of years. Marina grabbed my arm, her face pale with terror. She'd encountered entities like this before, knew what they were capable of. This wasn't just another shadow feeder. This was something older, more powerful, something that could reshape reality itself to suit its needs. If it fully awakened, if it emerged from whatever prison had contained it for millennia, our entire world would become its feeding ground. The ritual to contain it required specific components that we hadn't brought, elements that could only be gathered from places of power scattered across the continent. We needed water from the deepest cave in Carlsbad, earth from the burial mounds of Cahokia, fire from the volcanic vents of Yellowstone, and most critically, the willing sacrifice of someone whose bloodline connected them to the original binding. Dr. Thorne smiled as he realized our predicament. His family had spent generations ensuring that no one with the necessary bloodline survived. They'd systematically eliminated the descendants of the indigenous shamans who had originally imprisoned the entity, or so they thought. But they'd made one crucial mistake. Marina's grandmother hadn't died in the destruction of her village 15 years ago. She'd escaped, hidden, spent her remaining years training her granddaughter in the old ways, preparing her for this exact moment. Marina carried the bloodline, possessed the spiritual authority necessary to renew the ancient binding. The ritual began immediately. Marina cutting her palm with a knife blessed by 7 different medicine men, letting her blood flow onto symbols carved into the facility's foundation stones, speaking words in a language that predated human civilization, calling upon powers that had slept since the world was young. Dr. Thorne tried to stop her, transformed further, shedding his human disguise to reveal something that hurt to look at directly. But Jackson and his team had reached our position. They opened fire with weapons blessed by every major religion, silver bullets, inscribed with protective sigils, blessed salt rounds that could harm entities existing partially outside reality. The entity beneath the facility responded to the binding ritual, thrashing against constraints that had held it for thousands of years. The entire building began to collapse, walls cracking, floors tilting at impossible angles, reality itself straining under the pressure of forces too large for our dimension to contain. But Marina held the ritual together, even as blood poured from her eyes and nose, even as the spiritual strain threatened to tear her apart. She completed the binding, renewed the ancient prison, sent the entity back into the deep sleep from which Dr. Thorne had tried to wake it. Dr. Thorne screamed as his patron was imprisoned, his enhanced form beginning to dissolve, the supernatural enhancements his family had given him dependent on the entity's active presence in our reality. He tried to flee, to escape into whatever other dimensions he'd learned to access, but the facility's collapse trapped him, buried him under tons of rock and steel and consecrated earth. We rescued 19 children that night, the ones who could still be saved, the others, the ones who had been too thoroughly processed. We had to leave them, their bodies empty shells that would never again house human souls. It was the hardest decision I've ever had to make, but Marina assured me they were at peace, that whatever had made them human had already moved on to whatever comes after this life. The official investigation concluded that Midnight Meadows had been destroyed in a gas explosion, a tragic accident that had claimed the lives of Dr. Thorne and several staff members. The surviving children were returned to their families with carefully implanted memories of their treatment being successful, of leaving the facility healthy and ready to reintegrate into normal society. But our war against the Blackthorn Network was far from over. We discovered evidence of at least 12 other facilities in various stages of development, each one designed to serve a different entity, each one representing a threat to countless innocent lives. The family's resources seemed unlimited. Their connections reached into every level of government and law enforcement. That's when we learned about Project Harvest, the BLA Sketchwarani family's ultimate plan. They weren't just running individual facilities anymore. They were coordinating a continent-wide operation, designed to create simultaneous dimensional breaches at strategic locations, weak points in reality where the barriers between worlds were naturally thin. The plan was audacious in its scope. On the night of the next solar eclipse, 13 facilities would activate simultaneously, using the concentrated innocence of thousands of children to tear holes in reality itself. The entities they served would pour through these breaches like water through a broken dam, transforming our world into something unrecognizable. We had 18 months to stop them, 18 months to identify and neutralize 13 heavily defended facilities scattered across North America. It seemed impossible, but we'd learned that impossible was just another word for difficult when you were fighting for the survival of human civilization itself. Our network expanded rapidly, drawing in experts from around the world who had encountered similar threats in their own regions. Dr. Yuki Tanaka from Japan brought knowledge of entities that had been troubling the Pacific Rim for centuries. Colonel Dmitry Volkov from Russia shared intelligence about supernatural activities in Siberia that matched our own discoveries. We learned that the Blackthorn family wasn't unique. They were part of a global conspiracy that had been operating for millennia, families and organizations that served as intermediaries between our world and the hungry things that existed in the spaces between dimensions. Each group operated in their own territory, following traditions passed down through generations, but all working toward the same ultimate goal. The eclipse was approaching, the deadline growing closer with each passing day. We'd identified 7 of the 13 facilities, launched successful raids on 3, but each victory cost us dearly. The BLACHRNE network was adapting, learning from our tactics, preparing countermeasures that made each subsequent operation more dangerous than the last. The facility in Nevada was protected by creatures that wore human faces, but moved like liquid shadow. The compound in Georgia had been built over a nexus of ley lines that allowed its defenders to manipulate reality within a 50-mile radius. The installation in Alaska existed partially outside normal spacetime, its exact location shifting randomly to prevent detection. We were running out of time, running out of resources, losing team members faster than we could recruit new ones. The BLACHRNE network seemed to have unlimited funding, unlimited personnel, unlimited access to supernatural weapons and defenses that we could barely comprehend. That's when I received an unexpected ally, Victoria Blackthorn, Marlowe's daughter, who had grown up within the family network but had never fully understood what her relatives were really doing. She'd been raised to believe they were helping troubled children, providing services that mainstream society couldn't or wouldn't offer. But as she grew older, as she was given more responsibility within the organization, she began to see the truth, began to understand what the facilities really were, what happened to the children who entered them. The realization had driven her to the edge of madness, but it had also driven her to us. Victoria brought something invaluable: detailed intelligence about the remaining facilities, security protocols, operational schedules, and most importantly, the exact time and location of the eclipse ritual. The 13 facilities would activate in a specific sequence, timed to the moment of maximum solar occlusion, when the cosmic forces they were harnessing would be at their peak. But she also brought terrible news. The eclipse was only 3 months away, and the preparations were already too far advanced to stop through conventional means. The entities that would emerge through the dimensional breaches had been waiting for centuries. They were hungry, desperate, and they would not be denied their feast. Our only option was to turn the BLACHRN family's own plan against them, to use the eclipse ritual as a trap, to channel the cosmic energies they were harnessing into a binding that would imprison their patrons permanently. It would require precise timing, perfect coordination, and sacrifices that none of us were prepared to make. The night of the eclipse, our teams were positioned at each of the 13 facilities. We'd spent weeks preparing, gathering the materials we would need for the counter-ritual, training personnel who understood they might not survive the night. Each team knew their role in the larger plan, knew that failure at any single location would doom the entire operation. I was assigned to the primary facility, the one in the forests of northern Quebec where the Blackthorn family had been preparing for this night for over a decade. The buildings were ancient, constructed on ground that had been sacred to indigenous peoples for thousands of years before European colonization. The entire complex pulsed with supernatural energy, reality bending around concentrations of power that human science couldn't measure. Marlowe Blackthorn was there, leading the ritual personally. She'd aged dramatically since our last encounter, the strain of serving entities that existed outside normal reality taking its toll on her human form. But her eyes still held that same predatory intelligence, that same calculating hunger that had made her family so successful for so many generations. The children were arranged in 13 circles, each circle containing 13 victims, their ages ranging from 7 to 17, all of them selected for specific qualities that would make their innocence particularly potent. They'd been drugged, prepared through months of psychological conditioning, their natural defenses stripped away to make them perfect conduits for the energies Marlowe intended to harness. The eclipse began at 11:47 p.m., and with it, The dimensional breaches started to form, reality tearing like wet paper, revealing glimpses of the spaces between worlds where the BLSRNE family's patrons waited, things that had been hungry for centuries, that saw our world as an endless buffet of innocence and terror. Our counter-ritual began simultaneously, Marina leading the binding incantation, while Jackson and his team created a protective perimeter around our position. We'd learned from our previous encounters, prepared for the supernatural defenses the Blackthorn family would deploy. But nothing could have prepared us for the sheer scale of what we were facing. The sky itself began to bleed, aurora-like lights dancing across the heavens in colors that shouldn't exist. The forest around the facility twisted, trees growing into impossible shapes, their roots reaching toward the dimensional breaches like grasping fingers. Animals fled in every direction, their primitive instincts warning them of dangers their simple minds couldn't comprehend. Marlowe's ritual reached its crescendo as the eclipse reached totality, the moon completely obscuring the sun, casting the world into a darkness that felt alive, hungry watching. The dimensional breaches widened, and through them, we could see the entities beginning to emerge. They were vast, alien, beautiful, and terrible in ways that human language couldn't describe. Some appeared almost geometric, living mathematics that existed in more dimensions than our reality could contain. Others seemed organic, but wrong, like familiar creatures that had been redesigned by minds that understood biology differently than we did. But our counter-ritual was working. The binding energies we channeled were containing the breaches, preventing the entities from emerging fully into our reality. Marlowe realized what we were doing, turned away from her own ritual to focus on stopping ours, but it was too late. The cosmic forces were already in motion, beyond her ability to control. The facility began to collapse, reality reasserting itself as the eclipse passed totality, the dimensional breaches sealing as the binding energies reached critical mass. Marlowe screamed, a sound that shattered every piece of glass within 10 kilometers, as she realized her family's centuries of planning had been turned against them. But the victory came at a cost. Marina collapsed, her body unable to withstand the spiritual strain of channeling forces meant for beings far more powerful than humans. Jackson was torn apart by entities trying to force their way through the closing breaches, and dozens of our team members simply vanished, pulled into spaces between dimensions where human consciousness couldn't survive. When the eclipse ended, when normal daylight returned, the Blackthorn facilities lay in ruins, their supernatural infrastructure destroyed, the network of feeding grounds permanently closed. The surviving family members fled, disappeared into hiding places they had prepared for generations, but their power was broken, their ancient patrons imprisoned once again. 169 children were saved that night, rescued from fates worse than death. They were returned to families who would never know how close they'd come to losing everything, their memories carefully adjusted to spare them the trauma of what they'd experienced, what they'd been intended for. But the cost was almost more than we could bear. The survivors lost 37 members that night, people who had dedicated their lives to protecting innocence from predators that existed outside normal reality. They died heroes, but their deaths left holes in our hearts that would never fully heal. The world is safer now, the dimensional barriers restored, the ancient hungers contained, but vigilance remains necessary, because evil like the Blackthorn family never truly dies. It just waits, adapts, evolves, preparing for the next opportunity to feed on innocence and terror. That's why I'm telling you this story, why I've shared details that could put my life at risk. Because somewhere out there, other families, other organizations, other servants of entities that hunger for what only children can provide, are planning, preparing, waiting for their chance to succeed where the BLSHRNES failed. Stay vigilant, question facilities that seem too good to be true, investigate disappearances that don't make sense, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones that wear human faces, that speak in reasonable voices, that promise to help when their real intention is to harvest. If you've made it this far, if you've heard this entire story, then you're part of the survivors now, whether you realize it or not. You have the knowledge, the awareness, the responsibility to watch for signs that others might miss, to protect the innocent from threats they can't imagine. The phone number I'm about to share, it connects to a network of people like us, people who have seen the truth behind comfortable lies, who understand that our world is far more dangerous than most people realize. If you encounter something similar to what I've described, if children start disappearing in patterns that don't make sense, if you hear singing in languages that hurt to understand, call us. But be careful, because knowledge like this comes with a price. Once you've seen the darkness that exists in the spaces between worlds, you can never completely unsee it. It changes you, marks you, makes you a target for things that prefer their hunting grounds to remain secret. The BLA Star network is broken, but it's not extinct. Scattered remnants still operate in remote locations, still serve entities that hunger for innocence, still pose a threat to children whose parents trust the wrong people. Our war against them continues, will always continue, as long as there are predators who wear human faces and things that feed on terror and innocence. Thank you for listening, for bearing witness to truths that most people will never know. If this story has disturbed you, if it's given you nightmares, then it's done its job. Because comfortable sleep is a luxury we can't afford when children's lives are at stake. In the comments below, tell me what time you're watching this, where you're watching from, and whether you've encountered anything similar in your own area. Every piece of information helps. Every witness adds to our understanding of the threats we face. And if you have your own story, your own encounter with things that shouldn't exist, share it. Because silence only serves the predators. Hit that subscribe button. Ring the notification bell, and share this video with others who need to know the truth. The algorithms don't like content like this. They try to suppress it, bury it, keep it from reaching the people who most need to see it. But together, we can overcome their censorship, spread awareness, build a network of informed witnesses who can protect the innocent. What topic would you like me to cover next? What other mysteries, other horrors, other truths that society tries to hide? Let me know in the comments. Because there's so many stories still to tell, so many warnings still to share, so many predators still to expose. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and remember that the price of innocence is eternal vigilance against those who would consume it. The children of the world are counting on us, even if they don't know it, even if they can't imagine the threats we face on their behalf. This is Kieran, signing off, but never giving up, never forgetting. Never stopping to fight against darkness that wears human faces and feeds on childhood dreams.